Hello class, Professor Jim Albrecht here, and today we are studying Kate Chopin's novel, The Awakening, and I want to speak with you today about ways in which Chopin is rewriting the marriage plot in this novel. So one thing I want you to pay attention to is the way that this novel sets up parallels between various characters. So how do the secondary characters represent different possibilities for Edna, both female characters who represent different possibilities of female selfhood, and also male characters who trace out the social circumstances that shape Edna's possibilities. They're representatives of the social order, and they may also be potential romantic partners in the kind of traditional marriage plot of the novel. And I want to call your attention to Edna's growth or development as a protagonist, especially in the first half of the novel. What kind of a path is she on? What kind of a heroine is she, would you say? And what kind of a self is she struggling to develop? So first I want to look at several passages, three moments or scenes that position Edna in relation to Adèle Ratignolle and Robert Lebrun. That's the way you would pronounce his name down in Louisiana, Robert. So this first passage is from chapter 4, a famous passage in the novel. In short, Mrs. Pontellier was not a mother woman. The mother women seemed to prevail that summer at Grand Isle. It was easy to know them, fluttering about with extended protecting wings when any harm, real or imaginary, threatened their precious brood. They were women who idolized their children, worshipped their husbands, and esteemed it a holy privilege to efface themselves as individuals and grow wings as ministering angels. Many of them were delicious in the role. One of them was the embodiment of every womanly grace and charm. If her husband did not adore her, he was a brute, deserving of death by slow torture. Her name was Adèle Ratignolle. There are no words to describe her save the old ones that have served so often to picture the bygone heroine of romance and the fair lady of our dreams. There was nothing subtle or hidden about her charms. Her beauty was all there, flaming and apparent. The spun gold hair that comb nor confining pin could restrain, the blue eyes that were like nothing but sapphires, two lips that pouted that were so red one could only think of cherries or some other delicious crimson fruit in looking at them. She was growing a little stout, but it did not detract an iota from the grace of every step, pose, and gesture. Okay, what I'd like to call attention to here is partly the narrative tone, the way in which this description is so excessive or exaggerated, and this idea that motherhood would be a role, and a delicious role, that women would play. So this language describing Adèle Ratignolle, golden hair, eyes like sapphires, lips like cherries. This is a hyperbolic, exaggerated language taken from a bad romance novel or, cliched love poetry. And the language, that these women idolized their children, worshiped their husbands, and esteemed it a holy privilege to efface themselves as individuals and grow wings as ministering angels. There's something obviously very excessive or unreal about this image of woman as mother. It's the Victorian, really, the image of the angel in the house, right? Well, have we seen some image of womanhood like this before in the class? Well, yes, in Stowe, right? In the portrait of Mrs. Bird or Rachel Halliday. But it's different in Stowe, right? In Stowe, in Uncle Tom's Cabin, those women are very pious and earnest and the moral backbone of those households. Here, this image of the angelic mother is not quite as sincere. And if it isn't quite as sincere in Chopin's fictional world of 1899 versus Stowe's sentimental fiction of 1852, what's changed? Why? What are the costs of this kind of femininity? If it's a role and a delicious role for women to play, there must be something that is in some ways seductive about it, or there must be some benefits that women like Adèle Ratignolle get from playing this kind of a role. But what are the costs of it too? And so how does Chopin's novel assess the costs of this image of femininity? So I want to look then at two scenes with Madame Ratignolle and Robert that I think help us see how Edna relates to the gender roles of this society. So this is a scene with the three of them. Robert each summer at Grand Isle had constituted himself as the devoted attendant of some fair dame or damsel. Sometimes it was a young girl, again a widow, but as often as not it was some interesting married woman. Mrs. Pontellier liked to sit and gaze at her fair companion as she might look upon a faultless Madonna. Meanwhile, Robert, addressing Mrs. Pontellier, continued to tell of his one-time hopeless passion for Madame Ratignolle, of sleepless nights, of consuming flames till the very sea sizzled when he took his daily plunge, while the lady at the needle kept up a little running, contemptuous comment. And I cannot pronounce French, so apologies. Blagueur, farceur, grosse bête va, which is comedian, joker, get off it, right? He never assumed this serio-comic tone when alone with Mrs. Pontellier. She never knew precisely what to make of it. It was understood that he had often spoken words of love to Madame Ratignolle without any thought of being taken seriously. Mrs. Pontellier was glad he had not assumed a similar role toward herself. It would have been unacceptable, and annoying. Mrs. Pontellier had brought her sketching materials, which she sometimes dabbled with in an unprofessional way. She liked the dabbling. She felt in it a satisfaction of a kind which no other employment afforded her. She had wished to try herself on Madame Ratignolle. Never had that lady seemed a more tempting subject than at that moment, seated there like some sensuous Madonna, with the gleam of the fading day enriching her splendid color. The picture completed bore no resemblance to Madame Ratignolle. She was greatly disappointed to find that it did not look like her, but it was a fair enough piece of work and in many respects satisfying. Mrs. Pontellier evidently did not think so. After surveying the sketch critically, she drew a broad smudge of paint across its surface and crumpled the paper between her hands. Well, what does a scene like this tell us about the gender roles in Edna's society, in this New Orleans affluent society? What about the freedoms that women have and don't have, and about how men view women and treat women? Now, Robert is in the habit, apparently, of having a flirtation with a married woman every summer. And the mother woman, Adele Ratignolle, teases him and banters him about it. Well, what does it tell us? What does this tell us about the way that women and womanhood are viewed in this society? The way that men view women? Why do the husbands in this society not mind having a man like Robert entertain and flirt with their wives? And what does it tell us perhaps about the way that women view themselves, too? And especially I want you to notice here the way that Chopin is positioning Edna in relation to Adele and Robert. Edna's not participating in their banter. Instead, she is sketching, she's drawing. And what does Edna's painting, her art in the book, represent in relation to selfhood in the novel? She's trying to sketch Adele, who Edna thinks of as a sensuous Madonna, but she can't get the likeness right. Well, what do you think the symbolism of that moment is, that detail in the scene? Okay, and then one more scene in this series, I want to look at. This is a follow-up scene where Madame Ratignolle tells Robert basically to back off in his flirtation with Edna. And he responds in French, "Oh, so this is how Madame Ratignolle is jealous, right?" And she says, "Nonsense. I'm in earnest. I mean what I say. She is not one of us. She is not like us. She might make the blunder of taking you seriously." His face flushed with annoyance. "Am I a comedian, a clown, a jack-in-the-box? Why shouldn't she? You Creoles, I have no patience with you. I hope Mrs. Pontellier does take me seriously. I hope she has discernment enough to find in me something besides the blagueur. If I thought there was any doubt—" "Oh, enough, Robert," she broke in to his heated outburst. "You are not thinking of what you are saying. You speak with about as little reflection as we might expect from one of those children down there playing in the sand. If your attentions to any married women here were ever offered with any intention of being convincing, you would not be the gentleman we all know you to be, and you would be unfit to associate with the wives and daughters of the people who trust you. Madame Ratignolle had spoken what she believed to be the law and the gospel. You've made one mistake, Adele, he said with a light smile. There is no earthly possibility of Mrs. Pontellier ever taking me seriously. You should have warned me against taking myself seriously. Would you like a cup of bouillon? Shall I stir you a toddy? She told him he was a bon garçon, and she meant it. It's funny in this scene that Adele Ratignolle, this language of the law and the gospel being applied to, taking that religious language and applying it to the social rules in this society about flirtation and sex and sexuality. Again, what does this tell us about the way that men and women interact in this society? How do the men view women in this society? And what can women do and what can't they do? And what's the code of being a gentleman? She says, you wouldn't be the gentleman that we thought you were. What's the assumption here about what kind of treatment women need and want? And how does this scene cast a light back on the scene we just looked at, where Edna was sketching as Robert was bantering back and forth with Adele. And especially I want to call your attention to the end of this scene where when Adele accepts Robert's offer to go and get her a cordial drink, and he brings it back, and she calls him a bon garçon, which is a joke. It means a good waiter, right? Garçon is a way you can call a waiter in French. It literally means a boy, right, or a youth or a fellow. She's saying, you're a good boy, and the narrative says, and she meant it. So since Robert plays an important role in the second half of the novel, I want you to keep this moment in mind when you do read the second half of the novel, in terms of what this scene tells us about the society that Edna is in, and also about Robert himself and the role that he might play in her life. Okay, now, so again, these scenes we've just looked at, what do they tell us about the status of women in this culture? How are they to be viewed and treated? What kind of freedoms do they have as social and sexual beings? And how does Edna compare to the type of womanhood that Adele Ratignolle embodies? And also about Robert as a character and as a man and as a model of masculinity. Okay, so secondly, I want to spend some time thinking about how Edna is developing as a self in this first half of the novel by talking about her relations to another character who defines her social world, her husband, Léonce Pontellier. And think about the fact that there is a series of scenes in the first half of the novel between Léonce and Edna in which they have their scenes, right, in the sense of a scene between a married couple. They're arguments, disagreements. And so in the first few chapters, Léonce goes off to dine and gamble at Klein's, a resort down in the Grand Isle, and then when he comes back late, he wakes up the children and he blames Edna for being an inattentive mother. Well, the next day he's feeling a little bit guilty about it, so he leaves her money that he has won gambling and sends her candies from New Orleans, right? Then after Edna has her exhilarating midnight swim and she's come back to their cabin and she's on the porch in a swing, in a hammock, Léon says he can't permit Edna to stay out in the porch hammock, and so he stays out there and he smokes cigars and drinks wine until Edna relents and goes inside to bed. And then third, when they're back in New Orleans, back at their house in New Orleans, Léonce storms away from the dinner table one night to go have dinner at his club, and he's been arguing with Edna about her neglecting to be at home on Tuesday afternoons to receive social visits. And he's complaining about their cook. After he leaves, Edna takes a vase and she smashes it, and then she stomps her foot on her wedding ring in an attempt to crush it. But her maid comes in and picks up the ring, and Edna puts it back on. So there's this series of these kinds of disagreements between Léonce and Edna in this part of the novel. So I want to look at another one of these scenes and think about how Edna is reacting to her marriage and how is she developing as a person. This is from chapter 19. Edna could not help but think that it was very foolish, very childish to have stamped upon her wedding ring and smashed the crystal vase upon the tiles. She was visited by no more outbursts, moving her to such futile expedients. She began to do and feel as she liked. She completely abandoned her Tuesdays at home and did not return the visits of those who called upon her. She made no intellectual efforts to conduct her household en bon ménagère, as a good housewife. I don't. So again, apologies for my French. As a good housekeeper, going and coming as it suited her fancy, and so far as she was able, lending herself to any passing caprice. Mr. Pontellier had been a rather courteous husband, so long as he met a certain tacit submissiveness in his wife. But her new and unexpected line of conduct completely bewildered him. It shocked him. Then her absolute disregard for her duties as a wife angered him. When Mr. Pontellier became rude, Edna grew insolent. She had resolved never to take another step backward. It seems to me the utmost folly for a woman at the head of a household and the mother of children to spend in an atelier days which would be better employed contriving for the comfort of her family. I feel like painting, answered Edna. Perhaps I shan't always feel like it. Then in God's name paint, but don't let the family go to the devil. There's Madame Ratignolle. Because she keeps up her music, she doesn't let everything else go to chaos, and she's more of a musician than you are a painter. She isn't a musician, and I'm not a painter. It isn't on account of painting that I let things go. On account of what, then? Oh, I don't know. Let me alone. You bother me. It sometimes entered Mr. Pontellier's mind to wonder if his wife were not growing a little unbalanced mentally. He could see plainly she was not herself. That is, he could not see that she was becoming herself and daily casting aside that fictitious self which we assume like a garment with which to appear before the world. Okay, well, what does this scene show us about Leonce's attitudes toward Edna, what he as a husband expects from a wife and what he doesn't expect from a wife? What is Edna doing here? She says she was doing what she liked. And how does Leonce react? He gets angry. Edna responds to him by, and what is she doing again? She's painting. So again, we have this question of what does art mean in Edna, in her self-development in the novel? What does Leonce think about art? What kind of art does he think is appropriate for women? He cites Madame Ratignolle. It's hard not to think in a scene like this about Emerson or about Margaret Fuller, right? What would Fuller say about a scene like this, about what Edna wants from art and what Leonce seems to think is appropriate in terms of what would art mean to a woman, right? And also look at Edna's, the way that she responds to Leonce, that she has refused to take another step backwards, and she says to him, "Oh, let me alone, you bother me." And then Leonce's response to that, right? He says, it occurs to him that maybe his wife is a little unbalanced mentally. What kind of an attitude is that from a male figure about a woman and doing what Edna is doing? And then notice finally what the narrative voice says there. Comments that what he could see wasn't as important maybe as what Leonce could not see, that she was becoming herself and daily casting aside that fictitious self that we wear in front of the world. Well, that's an interesting statement. Becoming herself. What does it mean to become yourself? How can Edna in this novel become herself? Again, it's hard not to think of Emerson or Margaret Fuller when you hear that kind of a language of becoming yourself. And I hope you notice there will be a scene in the novel where Kate Chopin will have Edna reading Emerson's essays at a moment in the novel. So when we're looking at a scene like that, how do you think the novel is encouraging us as readers to react to Edna and to her efforts to become herself? The novel, is presenting a heroine who is unconventional for readers in 1899, and maybe even some readers today might have trouble identifying or sympathizing with Edna. Well, what about in a scene like that we just looked at? How do the other characters in the novel react to Edna? So how does Léonce, how does Adèle Ratignolle react to Edna? How does Robert and the later other characters who I won't talk about in this lecture, but Mademoiselle Rice and Dr. Mandelet? As readers, we can gauge our reactions to Edna partly in comparison to the way we see other characters reacting to her and the way that we think the novel is encouraging us to judge those other characters and the way that they view Edna. So what about a scene like that with Léonce? What do we think Edna is doing? And when we look at the way that Léonce is reacting to it, how does it make us as readers feel or think about what Edna is undergoing, what she's going through? So to close, I'll look at one of the moments in the novel. This is a very short chapter 6, and this is most of chapter 6, which is just the narrative trying to explain what kind of a process of transformation or an awakening Edna is undergoing. In short, Mrs. Pontellier was beginning to realize her position in the universe as a human being and to recognize her relations as an individual to the world within and about her. This may seem like a ponderous weight of wisdom to descend upon the soul of a young woman of 28. Perhaps more wisdom than the Holy Ghost is usually pleased to vouchsafe to any woman. But the beginning of things, of a world especially, is necessarily vague, tangled, chaotic, and exceedingly disturbing. How few of us ever emerge from such beginnings? How many souls perish in its tumult? The voice of the sea is seductive, never ceasing, whispering, clamoring, murmuring, inviting the soul to wander for a spell in abysses of solitude, to lose itself in mazes of inward contemplation. The voice of the sea speaks to the soul. The touch of the sea is sensuous, enfolding the body in its soft, close embrace. Well, what about the symbolism here of the sea? What do you think the sea is a symbol for? Is it a symbol of self-realization or of liberation? If so, how does that symbol work? What are the connotations or the meanings that we tend to associate with the ocean, with the sea? And what does this imagery tell us about what Edna is desiring or seeking? There's language here about inviting the soul to wander for a spell in abysses of solitude and inward contemplation. And then there is if there's the voice of the sea, there's also the touch of the sea that is described here. So what does that aspect of the imagery suggest about the transformation or the awakening that Edna is beginning to undergo? And what about this language of this wisdom, the weight, a ponderous weight of wisdom that has descended upon Edna? What is the wisdom that she is coming to realize? And then this interesting language that the beginning of things, of a world especially, is what is going on. What does it mean to say that the transformation that Edna is undergoing is the beginning of a world, and that such a beginning is necessarily vague, tangled, chaotic, disturbing? As you read through the second half of the book, and you consider how Edna attempts to become herself, think about what kinds of paths to self-realization Edna pursues. What possibilities are open to her? What obstacles does she face? And how or why does she finally succeed or fail? And I hope that the passages that I've taking us through here will provide you with some helpful perspectives as you consider those questions in the second half of the novel, and you consider the fate and the life of Kate Chopin's unconventional heroine, Edna Pontillier. And so with this for a start, I wish you happy reading. Thanks.